Imagine a secret so heavy it takes 20 years to find the words to speak it. For dozens of young girls in Orange County, California, that secret had a name, a whistle around his neck, and a smile that the world trusted. In the early 2000s, competitive cheerleading was a world of high-gloss perfection. A culture of glitter, gravity-defying stunts, and absolute discipline. But underneath the stadium lights, a predator was building a kingdom of silence. He wasn't a stranger in a dark alley. He was the man parents thanked for their daughter's success. This is the story of Erick Joseph Kristianson, a man who transformed the sanctuary of sport into a perverted catalog of victims, and the decade-long shadow he cast over Southern California. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. In 2002, the cheerleading circuit in Southern California was booming. It was more than a sport. It was a pathway to scholarships, social status, and identity. At the center of this world was Erick Joseph Kristianson. To the outside world, Kristianson was the ultimate professional, charismatic, capable, and deeply invested in the success of his athletes. He didn't just hold one job. He embedded himself into the very fabric of the community. He was a staple at Magic All-Stars in Anaheim, a prestigious competitive cheer club. He served as an assistant coach at Trabuco Hills High School in Mission Viejo and worked with athletes at Mission Viejo High School. But his reach extended even further. Long before he was a recognized coach, he was a counselor at a South Orange County YMCA sleepaway camp, a position he held as early as 1999. These weren't just career milestones, they were carefully selected access points. Kristianson understood the unique psychology of cheerleading. It is a sport that requires intense physical contact, absolute discipline, and a deep, secondary parental bond between the athlete and the coach. In this environment, the word of a coach is law. Kristianson used this position of authority to bypass the natural defenses of children and their families. He didn't start with violence. He started with the most dangerous weapon in a predator's arsenal: special attention. The prosecution would later describe Kristianson's actions as becoming increasingly brazen and emboldened with every passing year. He was a master of the slow burn. He would identify a target, often a girl as young as 9 or 10, and begin a process of isolation. He created inner circles where certain girls were made to feel elite, chosen, or more talented than their peers. This wasn't just about sports, it was about emotional dependency. One of his most effective tools was the creation of a surfing club. On the surface, it looked like quintessential California team bonding, a coach taking his students to the beach to build camaraderie and fitness. But the reality was a calculated hunting ground. Prosecutors revealed that Kristianson would meet with his targets in the quiet hours of the morning before the lessons officially began. In the secluded areas of the beach, at local community centers, or in the cramped, private confines of his car, the mentorship was replaced by exploitation. He played on the vulnerabilities of youth. One survivor, who met him when she was only 11 because she was friends with his younger brother, recalled how the abuse began while they were simply watching a movie, a setting that felt safe, domestic, and routine. Another victim, only 14 at the time, was lured into a flirtatious relationship that Kristianson expertly framed as a mature romance. He even took her to a high school dance, standing alongside her as a boyfriend might, despite being a 21-year-old adult. He wasn't just breaking the law. He was rewriting the moral compass of these children, making them believe that his attention was a reward rather than a crime. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. Perhaps the most haunting chapter of this early era is the year 2005. While Kristianson was coaching at Trabuco Hills, his behavior finally raised enough red flags for a report to be made. Orange County Sheriff's deputies actually detained him. They had him in an interrogation room. The legal system had a chance to stop the clock right then and there. However, the culture of silence Kristianson had built was too strong. The victims were children trapped in a web of fear and embarrassment. They were athletes who didn't want to lose their spot on the team or disappoint their parents. Without the testimony of the victims, and in an era before digital forensics could easily track grooming patterns, the evidence wasn't enough to sustain a charge. The investigation went cold. Kristianson walked out of that police station and back into the gyms of Orange County. He didn't take the detention as a warning to stop. He took it as a validation of his own brilliance. He believed he had outsmarted the law. For the next 3 years in California, he continued to coach at Magic All-Stars, emboldened by the belief that he was untouchable. He continued to take girls to his home, continued to bond with them at off-campus events, and continued to leave a trail of psychological wreckage that his victims were too terrified to report. By 2008, Kristianson began to shift his focus. Whether it was the heat of the 2005 investigation or a desire for a fresh catalog of victims, he started moving. He left the high-profile gyms of Southern California, but he didn't leave the sport. He took his credentials, his charm, and his dark secrets across state lines. He spent time in Kansas and eventually made his way to the Atlantic coast of Florida. For nearly 15 years, the girls of Orange County tried to forget. They grew into women, went to college, and started careers, but many carried a weight they couldn't explain. 2 of the girls quit cheerleading immediately after the abuse, their passion for the sport permanently poisoned. They lived with the crushing thought that they were alone, that they were the only ones weak enough to let it happen. They didn't know that Kristianson hadn't changed. He had simply moved his operation to a new zip code, waiting for the world to catch up to his digital footprint. In 2022, Kristianson was living in Daytona Beach, Florida, working at a new cheer club and assuming his past was buried under 2 decades of dust. But the digital age he now lived in wouldn't be as forgiving as the analog world of 2005. A single FaceTime call between the trusted coach and a new group of teenage girls was about to trigger a notification that would travel 2,500 miles back to California, reaching the phone of a woman who had been waiting 20 years for a reason to finally speak his name. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. By 2021, Erick Joseph Kristianson had transitioned from the Magic All-Stars era of California to the humid, high-energy world of Florida competitive cheerleading. He was working as a coach at Champion Elite Legacy, a prominent cheer club in Daytona Beach. For a man who had successfully evaded justice in 2005, Florida represented a clean slate. However, the predator who once relied on secluded community centers and beachside surf lessons had now discovered the terrifying efficiency of the digital age. The investigation in Volusia County, Florida, began with a report that was strikingly modern. Prosecutors alleged that between 2021 and 2022, Kristianson had begun using FaceTime as a tool for exploitation. He wasn't just coaching these girls in the gym. He was invading their homes through their screens. He was accused of masturbating on camera to 3 girls between the ages of 11 and 13, children who looked up to him as a figure of authority and expertise. But the abuse wasn't confined to the digital realm. The Florida charges also included a harrowing allegation that he had physically molested a 13-year-old girl, proving that his predatory habits were just as physical and intrusive as they had been 20 years prior. In August 2022, the law finally caught up with him, briefly. Kristianson was not found in Florida. He was arrested in Kansas on a Florida warrant. This geographic mobility was a hallmark of his lifestyle. He was a man who moved when the heat got too high. He was extradited back to Florida to face charges of lewd and lascivious exhibition and molestation. To the public, it seemed like the end of the road. But the legal system in Florida provided a loophole that almost allowed him to vanish forever. Despite the gravity of the charges involving multiple children, Kristianson was granted a $300,000 bond. He paid it because the court placed no travel restrictions on his release. Kristianson was legally allowed to leave the state. He didn't just leave Florida, he became a ghost. He was out on bail. But in reality, he was a fugitive from the inevitable tidal wave of his past. While Florida prosecutors were building their case, Kristianson was likely assuming that as long as he stayed away from Daytona Beach, he was safe. He was wrong. As the news of the Florida arrest hit the headlines, the Orange County District Attorney's Office began to receive phone calls that would change everything. The catalyst was a single news report that surfaced in Southern California. A young woman, now in her 30s, saw Kristianson's mugshot on her screen. The man she had tried to forget, the man who had picked her up from school for lunch, taken her to his home and molested her from age 14 to 16, was back in the news for doing the exact same thing to a new generation of girls. She realized she wasn't alone. She realized that her silence in 2005 hadn't protected her. It had only allowed him to find new victims. She called the authorities. Then another woman called. Then another. The domino effect that Kristianson had feared for 2 decades was finally in motion. Orange County investigators, led by Deputy District Attorney Juliet Oliver, began to piece together a timeline that reached back to the early 2000s. They discovered that Kristianson's perverted catalog wasn't limited to Florida. He had been a serial offender in California, preying on athletes at Magic All-Stars, Trabuco Hills High School, and Mission Viejo High School. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. While California was building its case, the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force was tracking Kristianson's trail. He was no longer just a coach with a warrant. He was a high-priority fugitive. The Marshals tracked his movements through a maze of financial records and tips. He had effectively disappeared from the southern United States. He wasn't in Kansas, he wasn't in Florida, and he certainly wasn't in California. Kristianson had moved to Fargo, North Dakota, a city near the Canadian border, far from the coastal cheerleading hubs where his face was known. He lived there under the radar, likely assuming that the thousands of miles between him and his victims provided a permanent shield. He was hiding in plain sight, as DA Todd Spitzer would later say, banking on the hope that the women in California were still too embarrassed or too broken to stand up against him. But the investigators were relentless. They knew that a man who had been active for 20 years wouldn't stop. They knew that every day he was free was a day another child was at risk. They coordinated with local North Dakota authorities, narrowing the search down to a specific neighborhood in Fargo. The task force moved in with the precision of a military operation, knowing that Kristianson had a history of fleeing the moment he felt the pressure. On April 25, 2023, the quiet of a Fargo residential street was broken. U.S. Marshals arrived at the door of the residence where Kristianson was staying. They didn't find a man who was ready to surrender. They found a man who was so convinced of his own ability to manipulate the system that he didn't even try to run when he saw them. He was returning from a park, walking with an air of casual normalcy that was chilling to the investigators who knew what was in his file. As the officers approached, Kristianson's reaction was one of pure arrogance. He didn't ask what was happening. He tried to tell the officers what was happening. He was a man who had spent 20 years gaslighting children, and he was now attempting to gaslight the federal government. He spoke of his bail and his hearings, trying to frame the arrest as a procedural error. But the Marshals had a warrant that changed the game. This wasn't about a FaceTime call in Florida anymore. This was about 20 years of trauma in California. As the Marshals began to read him his rights and place him in handcuffs, Kristianson turned to his brother and asked for his phone and his wallet. He was still trying to maintain an image of taking care of things. But then, one of the officers mentioned the specific nature of the California warrant. The calm in Kristianson's eyes flickered for the first time. He realized that this wasn't just a Florida misunderstanding. This was a resurrection of the ghosts he thought he had buried in 2005. And back in California, the survivors were already boarding planes to ensure he would never have the chance to take care of another child again. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. By early 2023, Erick Joseph Kristianson had perfected the art of the disappearing act. Following his release on bond in Florida, he didn't return to the warm climates of the South or the West. Instead, he headed for the northern border, settling in the quiet, frigid environment of Fargo, North Dakota. To his neighbors, he was just another resident. To his family, he was a man being wrongfully persecuted. He believed that the thousands of miles between him and the Orange County District Attorney's office provided a permanent safety net. He lived as if the FaceTime calls in Florida and the surf lessons in California belonged to a different man entirely. But while Kristianson was enjoying the anonymity of the Midwest, the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force was closing in. They had been tracking his digital footprint, his financial transactions, and the few social connections he hadn't yet severed. On April 25, 2023, the operation culminated in a suburban neighborhood in Fargo. The marshals didn't need to kick down a door. As they established their perimeter, Kristianson himself stepped out from the front door of the residence, looking like a man without a care in the world. The body cam footage of the arrest is a chilling document of Kristianson's personality. As the federal agents surrounded him, he didn't panic, run, or resist. He adopted a tone of weary cooperation, the same calm, authoritative voice he had used for decades to command cheer gyms. When informed there was a warrant for his arrest out of California, his response was immediate and calculated. "No, we've been taking care of this." He spoke to the officers as if they were colleagues discussing a minor administrative error. He mentioned his lawyer by name, talked about pretrial stuff he had just finished over Zoom for the Florida case, and tried to frame the California warrant as a mistake. He was attempting to use his intelligence and composure to gaslight the federal government the same way he had gaslight 9-year-old girls. He stayed focused on his rights, complaining that his phone and computer had been illegally taken in Florida, casting himself as the victim of a constitutional overreach. During the arrest, Kristianson's brother was present, adding a layer of domestic tension to the scene. The interaction revealed the protective bubble Kristianson had built around his family. His brother defended him, clearly believing the narrative Erick had spun, that these were false allegations from disgruntled people in his past. This double life was his greatest achievement. Even with handcuffs ratcheting shut on his wrists, he maintained the facade of a respectable professional who was simply caught in a legal web. The flight from North Dakota to California was the beginning of the end for Kristianson's freedom. Once he was back on Orange County soil, the full weight of the indictment was unsealed. This wasn't just a handful of charges. It was a 23-count felony indictment that read like a timeline of a serial predator's career. The charges included 11 felony counts of lewd or lascivious acts upon a child under 14, 4 felony counts involving children aged 14 or 15, 8 counts of sexual penetration by a foreign object. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The youngest victim was only 9 years old. Prosecutors revealed that Kristianson's abuse had begun as early as 1999 during his time as a YMCA camp counselor and continued through his tenure at Magic All-Stars and Trabuco Hills High School. As the survivors, now women in their late 20s and 30s, began to sit down with investigators, the fear and embarrassment that had silenced them in 2005 was replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. They weren't just victims. They were witnesses to a 20-year crime spree. As the trial moved toward 2025, Kristianson's defense team realized they couldn't argue against the existence of the women. Instead, they attacked the nature of the relationships. They focused on the romance aspect of the grooming. They highlighted that one victim had been excited to go to a high school dance with him when she was 14 and he was 21. They argued that because some victims remained in contact with him or liked his photos on Instagram years later, the abuse couldn't have been traumatic. It was a classic attempt to use the perfect victim trope. They wanted the jury to believe that if a child is manipulated into loving their abuser, then the abuser isn't a predator. But the prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Juliet Oliver, countered this with a devastating truth. He's had over 2 decades to come up with this absolutely ridiculous story. She pointed out that Kristianson wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was hiding in plain sight, using his whistle and his clipboard as a shield. In a final, desperate move during the December 2025 trial, Kristianson took the stand in his own defense. He looked at the jury and delivered a testimony that many in the courtroom found absurd. He claimed he was never alone with the girls. He claimed that the gyms had security cameras that would have caught him, ignoring the fact that most of the abuse happened in cars, homes, and community centers. Then, he made a claim that would become the centerpiece of his denial. He told the jury that he didn't lose his virginity until he was 27 years old, years after the first victims claimed he had molested them. He was betting that his virginity defense would override the collective, consistent testimony of 10 women who didn't even know each other but described the exact same patterns of abuse. He sat on the stand, calm and composed, the same man who had walked back from a park in Fargo thinking he was untouchable. The jury began their deliberations on a Monday in December. Kristianson sat in the courtroom, his hands folded, still wearing the mask of the misunderstood coach. He was facing a maximum sentence of 165 years to life, a triple-digit reckoning that would effectively ensure he died in prison. As the jury foreperson stood up to read the first of 23 verdicts, the courtroom went silent. The women who had carried this weight for 20 years held their breath, realizing that the virginity defense and the Fargo escape were about to meet the final, unyielding wall of the law. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. On December 15, 2025, the silence of 20 years was finally replaced by the word guilty. The Orange County jury returned a verdict that was as comprehensive as Kristianson's crimes. Guilty on all 23 felony counts. The jury didn't believe the virginity story. They didn't believe the Instagram defense. They saw the 9-year-old child on his lap. They saw the 11-year-old at the YMCA camp. They saw the 14-year-old he took to a high school dance. The conviction was a total repudiation of Kristianson's good guy persona. DA Todd Spitzer's office released a statement that would define the case. For decades, Erick Kristianson used cheerleading gyms in Orange County and across the country as a kind of perverted catalog. The catalog was officially closed. Kristianson, now 46 years old, was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, no longer the coach, but a convicted child molester facing 165 years to life, plus an additional 6 years and 8 months for sentencing enhancements. The sentencing, scheduled for March 19, 2026, will be more than just a legal formality. It will be the first time the survivors can speak directly to the court about the ripples of his actions. 2 of the women revealed they had quit cheerleading, a sport they loved, because of the trauma he inflicted. Others spoke of the difficulty in forming adult relationships after having their perception of love and trust warped by a 21-year-old predator when they were barely teenagers. The victim impact statements will serve as the final chapter of their recovery. For many, the conviction itself was the medicine they needed. Deputy District Attorney Juliet Oliver noted that these women were living their lives until the Florida arrest in 2022 gave them the permission they didn't know they needed to finally speak out. The bravery of the first woman to call the DA's office after seeing the mugshot from Florida cannot be overstated. She was the first domino that brought down a 20-year empire. While California has secured its justice, the case in Volusia County, Florida remains an open wound. Kristianson still faces charges there for his actions at Champion Elite Legacy. The 3 girls in Florida, aged 11 to 13, who were exposed to his lewd FaceTime acts and physical molestation, now have the backup of the California conviction. Whether he is ever physically transported back to Florida to face those charges remains a legal question. But the California sentence ensures he will never have the opportunity to hurt another child in Daytona Beach or anywhere else. The Florida case was the key that unlocked the California cell. Without the modern FaceTime crimes, the 2005 crimes might have remained buried forever. It is a stark reminder of how serial predators operate. They don't stop. They just move. Kristianson's geographic mobility from California to Kansas to Florida to North Dakota was a strategic effort to outrun his reputation. But in the end, the digital news cycle moved faster than he did. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The legal system has one final tool to ensure Kristianson never returns to society: the Sexually Violent Predators Act, SVP. Because he has been convicted of substantial sexual conduct against more than 2 victims, California law allows the state to petition for his civil commitment. This means that even if he were to somehow serve his 165-year sentence, which is biologically impossible, the state could keep him in a high-security mental health facility indefinitely if he is deemed a persistent threat. His history, spanning from 1999 to 2022, makes him a textbook candidate for this law. He demonstrated that he could not work in a gym without grooming a child. He demonstrated that he could not live in a community without using his coach status to isolate victims. The SVP designation is the ultimate insurance policy for the families of Orange County. The case of Erick Joseph Kristianson is now a landmark in California's fight against institutional child abuse. It has forced youth sports organizations to look beyond basic background checks. Kristianson had a clean record for years because his victims were too scared to report him. The lesson learned is one of vigilance. It is a reminder that predators often hold the most trusted positions in a child's life: the coach, the counselor, the mentor. But the most important legacy of this case is the power of the collective voice. 10 women, separated by decades and thousands of miles, stood together to dismantle a man who thought he was smarter than all of them. They turned their fear and embarrassment into a weapon of justice. As Kristianson awaits his formal sentencing in March 2026, the gyms of Mission Viejo and Anaheim are quieter, and the ghosts of the past can finally rest. Erick Joseph Kristianson is currently held at the Theo Lacey facility, awaiting his permanent transfer to the California Department of Corrections. His virginity defense and his Fargo hideout are now historical footnotes in a 23-count felony conviction. The architect of trust has been revealed as the architect of trauma, and the world he once manipulated is finally, safely out of his reach. And as always, you've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every case is examined with facts, clarity, and respect for the people affected. If you want to see more fact-based true crime stories like this one, make sure you subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, remember, the truth is never buried.